This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I want to give a special thank you to Adam Haar and David Reingold, who both just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so now let's get to our show. Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, and welcome to episode 593 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Warren Lapine, who joined us back in episode 534 to discuss his book Immer's Laz, a collection of hundreds of letters written by legendary fantasy and science fiction author Roger Zelazny. Warren is also the author of the short story collection Just Like the Jetsons, and together with Roger's son Trent Zelazny, he edited the book Shadows and Reflections, a Roger Zelazny tribute anthology. And in this interview, we'll be discussing Warren's new book on writing science fiction and fantasy by Roger Zelazny, which collects 20 articles that Roger wrote between 1964 and 1994. And now here's our interview with Warren Lapine. All right, so we're here with Warren Lapine. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me again.
Okay, so you just published a book called On Writing Science Fiction and Fantasy by Roger Zelazny. So how'd this book come about?
Well, I mean, I've been aware forever that he had written these articles because I'm an avid Zelazny collector. In fact, I have over 450 unique items in my Zelazny collection. You know, so I've read a lot of this in the original publications in the magazines as I picked them up. And it occurred to me there was more than enough of it to do a book. And I mentioned that to Trent Zelazny a couple of years ago. And it's something we thought about. And then for some reason, we decided it was time to put it together. And it would have been out more than a year ago, but Trent was going to write the intro. And that just didn't happen because his life was incredibly busy and he wasn't able to. And then unfortunately, he died. But so he wasn't able to write it. So I went ahead and wrote the intro that he was going to write and published the book. I mean, he did get to see the finished product, fortunately.
Yeah, I was so sad to hear about Trent. I never met him, but my wife and I have been traveling to Santa Fe recently because we live in Austin now, and so we've sort of been meeting people in the writing community there. So he was definitely someone I was hoping to connect with at some point.
Yeah, I mean, he is a story, and basically, he'd had a stroke, and so his memory wasn't great. But he lives alone, and he apparently couldn't remember how much acetaminophen he'd had. So basically, Tylenol killed him. You know, I don't think most people realize how dangerous Tylenol can be to your liver.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that was what happens. I mean, definitely, I only learned that recently how close the effective dose is to the fatal dose with Tylenol, and you really have to be careful with it.
Very, very careful. So if one person hears this and says, "Oh, maybe I shouldn't take that second or third or fifth dose," and lives, then hopefully something decent will have come of that.
Yeah, but if people don't know, you and Trent had become really good friends, right? Like,
yes, we were quite close. Yeah, we talked to each other weekly, generally.
And last time I talked to you was about 2 years ago. You edited a book of Roger Zelazny's letters to his friend Carl Yoke. And I was thinking today that, when I feel like I kind of knew Trent because Roger wrote so many letters about him growing up and everything he was doing and everything. And the part that really sticks out in my mind is Roger does a parent-teacher conference, with one of Trent's teachers. Mm-hmm. And the teacher says, quote, "There are a lot of kids who will get better grades than Trent, but of all the kids I've ever taught, he's the only one whose name I think I'll hear somewhere 20, 30 years from now. Yep. He's got something I can't define, but very classy going for him. Don't tell him I said this."
Yeah, that was Trent. There was definitely a lot there. He was a very complicated, accomplished man.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward. I haven't read any of his fiction. I'm really looking forward to checking that out when I can. Um, I also saw George R. R. Martin wrote a really nice, blog post about him, where there's this picture of Trent as a little kid at a science fiction convention, and he's wearing a T-shirt that says "My dad wrote Lord of Light." So I thought that was really cute.
Yeah, I miss the guy a lot.
Yeah. Okay, but so he wasn't able to write the intro, and then kind of what happened with this on writing fantasy and science fiction book after that?
Well, after that, I mean, the book was laid out and finished, all except for the introduction. And so before he died, Trent just told me, look, dude, I can't do it. I'm having trouble with it. Please write it for me. So I did. But unfortunately, that didn't get finished until after Trent, because I figured I'd wait a little while and see if he changed his mind. I've got so many books I'm publishing that I was okay with waiting a little bit on that. And then unfortunately, that tragedy struck. And so then that put me in a place where it was time to write it, so I did.
Well, no, and I'm so happy that this book is out. I was so excited. I'm on the Roger Zelazny Facebook group. I think it's called Roger Zelazny, Master of Amber Facebook.
Oh yeah,
group.
yeah. I'm actually, I believe they made me a moderator on that one. I know I post there a lot. I always let them know when there's something new coming. It's the first place I ever mention anything.
Yeah, so I saw you post about this book on there, so I've been eagerly anticipating it. Yeah. And so I didn't actually, and I'd read some of these pieces before, like there's one called Creating a Science Fiction Novel or something like that. I know I've read that before. It must have been in one of his short story collections or something that I read.
Yeah, a number of them were in his short story collections, and some were in the Writer and Writer's Digest, places like that.
Yeah. But some of these are in these fanzines, which I'm not too familiar with. So did you have copies of all those fanzines?
I did. Yep, I do. As I said, I've got all but maybe 20 first appearances of everything Zelazny ever wrote. And the ones that I don't have are, really obscure 10, 20 copy fanzines.
And so you said you've collected these over the years. So was it hard to get your hands on any of these, or?
It was extremely hard. It still is hard to get my hands on a whole bunch of the ones because I would like to have had a complete collection, especially before eBay and the internet. It was very, very hard. I mean, I lived in New England, and from within 100 miles of my house, there was at least 50 to 200 used bookstores, and I would haunt them. And then when I started going to conventions, I would look through every single bookshelf and all the magazines looking for what I didn't have.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm really glad that you did, so that we can all have this book. And so these fanzine articles, were these things that Zelazny wrote? Was he getting paid for them, or was he doing them as favors for friends?
Mostly he was getting paid, but sometimes he would give stuff to a magazine if it didn't sell somewhere at a larger place. He had edited fanzines when he was younger, so I think he had a different relationship with those fanzines than a lot of authors who never had anything to do with them.
Because, I mean, one thing that really, from reading this book, that really came across so strongly was just his love of science fiction, just how much he loves the field and how much he has this exhaustive knowledge of its history. And, a lot of authors would sort of, at least to some degree, denigrate the genre or say that they're transcending it or something like that. And there's never a hint of that in any of these essays. It's just pure love is what comes through in every single one.
I would agree. I mean, Roger was such a literate writer that he got respect outside of the field without having to ask for it. And so that may have also made it easier for him to not have some of the ambivalence that other writers have, where, they want to be respected by people outside of science fiction, and they're just not, because generally science fiction isn't respected outside. I remember running into that as a college student who wrote, and they were just like, don't write this garbage. And I was like, I'm reading the stuff you guys love, and it's just not that good. And so from my point of view, it really doesn't matter what people outside of the literature think of it. I think that science fiction fantasy is going to be remembered considerably better than the Ludlums and the people who everybody loves now, they're just going to be forgotten. Like, name the 10 writers who were bigger than Melville from his time. Worrying about that sort of stuff is just wrong. And I don't think Roger ever did.
Well, in one of these essays, he references, I'm trying to remember who the critic was, but this critic took a stab at naming the authors from his day who would be remembered in 100 years or whatever, and he came up with 3 names, and like nobody's ever heard of them.
Or of any of them. When I got out of publishing when I decided magazines were no longer working, and before I came back into books. But I remember when I came back into books, I reached out to people that I'd had like tussles with, or people I hadn't gotten along with, and said, I'm older now. Let's just start over. I don't want to have any of the politics and stuff that went on. And one of the people that I spoke with was Jeff Vandermeer. And I remember we were talking, and I was like, you know what? I'm not going to waste 1 minute worrying about how anybody sees me now, because I believe that 200 years from now, some grad student's going to decide who gets remembered. And they'll write their paper, they'll defend their dissertation. It'll get out there, and those will be the people that remembered. And none of us have any say in that at all.
Yeah, for sure. And so one of the things that Zelazny brings up in these essays, I mean, since these were all, appeared separately, there's a certain amount of overlap in what he covers in the different essays. And one thing that he just brings up over and over again is how he thinks that science fiction is actually, in some ways, more sophisticated than literary fiction, because of there's a critic he quotes a lot named Northrop Frye, who had this idea that there's sort of 4 modes that literature falls into. I don't know if you want to talk about that, or I could give a quick rundown.
I know that I'm like 50 books past this one.
Yeah.
I mean, I know what you're talking about. And the heroic mode. I mean, science fiction hits it all, and very few other literatures do.
Yeah, I'll just give a quick. So Northrop Frye said that there were 4 modes of literature: the mythic mode, the high mimetic, low mimetic, and ironic. And the mythic mode is basically stories about gods. The high mimetic is basically stories about legendary heroes. The low mimetic is stories about ordinary people. And the ironic is stories about fools and people that we laugh at. And Zelazny said that literary fiction had more or less abandoned the mythic mode and the high mimetic mode, whereas science fiction still and fantasy still embrace those. So there's actually, in a way, a wider range of character types that you would see.
And we're able to say more about our culture and about our world because we can dress it up in fantasy and science fiction. I mean, the Strugatsky brothers got away with just slamming the hell out of the Russian government when they were at they're very most likely to punish you and to censor your work because it was science fiction. We've always been able to say things. I mean, what book do you hear the most now? Do you hear people talk about 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale? Because both of them were making statements that are very, very pertinent. And, other people who did it, it comes off as just more pedantic and then gets forgotten.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and so science fiction has always been my favorite. Fantasy and science fiction has always been my favorite type of fiction. So,
or at least since I found Zelazny, it has been.
Yeah. So that was really cool. And then another thing I really liked in the book was he has just a lot of, some of these essays, like there's one called A Burnt Out Case, which is just so full of amazing anecdotes, amazing quotations. It's just so packed. And I actually realized a lot of my favorite anecdotes are actually from this essay, which I read when I was younger, and I had just forgotten that I had I'd mined them all from this one essay. But just his stories about interacting with Philip K. Dick are just absolutely hilarious.
Yeah. I mean, I've got the letters that he and Philip K. Dick wrote to each other. I did not publish the part that Philip K. Dick wrote when I put out the Immer's Laz. I just published Roger's responses, but it was very, very interesting to see that. I mean, Roger at some point talked about how he had epilepsy, and so when whenever he had a breakout and had an actual epileptic fit, he felt like it was almost, he could understand why people in the old age, back in the day who didn't understand what it was, thought they'd talk to God. And so I thought it was really interesting, the conversations that he had. The other thing I found really fascinating is when he started talking to Philip K. Dick, because he finished writing Desiree for him, or he was going to finish it. Then he sent Philip K. Dick his finished chapter to make sure Philip K. Dick was happy with it. And he got unblocked, and he wrote a chapter and sent it to Roger. And then they wrote back and forth. They wrote the chapters back and forth. But it was really clear that Philip K. Dick was in this horrible place with no money at the beginning of the letters. And by the end of it, he had money to spare and life was great. His movie had hit, and things were really good. And it was interesting watching this man who was very depressed and in despair rise up out of it, and that being Philip K. Dick. When Blade Runner hit, his whole life changed. And this book sold really well too, so he was pretty happy about that.
Yeah, so we're talking about this book. It's a Latin phrase. It's spelled Deusirae. I
probably butchered it, even though I had 4 semesters of Latin in college.
Yeah, I think it must be Deus Irae, something like that.
Yeah, well, I unfortunately just never really tried. I hate Latin. If I'd known I was going to have to decline my nouns, I would have declined the subject.
But so that's the book we're talking about, and so one thing that was really funny that I is in this book that I just read is that Philip K. Dick had written a section of this, and Roger Zelazny was going to pick it up. And he thought, I'll try to just mimic Philip K. Dick's style as much as I can. So he sort of read a bunch of Philip K. Dick's books and felt like he had completely mastered the trick of writing in Philip K. Dick's voice.
I'd say he did. It's my second least favorite Zelazny book because it reads too much like a Philip K. Dick novel. Now, mind you, that doesn't mean I didn't like it, because I do like Philip K. Dick's work. I just find that Zelazny was so much more a stylist that I just liked him a lot better.
Yeah, I think there's no question that Zelazny is a much better stylist than Philip K. Dick, although they're both, two of my favorite authors.
Same. So I wanted to make that clear. Calling it my second least favorite Zelazny novel is no attack on Philip K. Dick.
Yeah. But there's a funny detail. I don't know if you remember this, but so there's a funny detail where Zelazny ultimately decides he's going to sort of try to pitch it. He's mastered the art of writing exactly like Philip K. Dick, but he's going to try to pitch it sort of halfway between their styles so that it'll be not just it'll just not read just like another Philip K. Dick novel. But there's one scene where he decides, I'm just going to write this one scene 100% Philip K. Dick's in Philip K. Dick's style. And so he gets Philip K. Dick's notes back on it. And Philip K. Dick says, like, Roger, all this material you've written is great, but this one scene is absolute genius.
Yeah, I could totally see that. That is amusing.
And there's also this story about they're at a convention in France together, and Roger is giving a book signing, so he misses Phil's talk, and people just keep coming out and reporting on what Phil said at his talk, and it's just all this bizarre stuff. I don't know if you remember this.
I do remember that bit. And I know that Philip K. Dick was having a lot of mental health issues at that point.
Yeah, like so basically people come out and they're like, Phil said this weird thing and this weird thing and this weird thing. I'll just give you listeners a sample here. One person comes out and says, well, in the lecture, he said that there are many parallel time tracks, and we're on the wrong one because of the fact that God and the devil are playing a game of chess. And every time one makes a move, it reprograms us to a different time track, and that whenever Phil Dick writes a book, it switches us back to the proper track. Could you care to comment on this? And so Roger, finally he's able to talk to Phil and says, Phil, what the heck did you talk about? And Phil says, well, actually, I had a translator because, it's in France.
Right.
And at the last minute, they said I had to cut 20 minutes out of my talk. And so I went through randomly scratching stuff out, and the translator did too, but we got all mixed up and he scratched out all the wrong stuff. So I didn't even know in the end what he said.
Yeah, that's always amusing if you got somebody else saying what you said and it's not the same.
Yeah. So it's, so if you're interested in stories like that, there's a lot of those in this book, a lot of just amazing anecdotes. And I was going to actually ask you, because you had the experience when you wrote your story, The Night Heirs.
Yes.
You and Trent did an anthology called Shadows and Reflections, which is all stories written in the worlds of different Roger Zelazny stories.
Right.
And so do you want to just, for listeners, if they're not familiar, do you want to just say a bit about that book?
Well, yeah, for anyone who's not familiar, we did an anthology where people would use characters, not just write like Zelazny, but try to actually work in his worlds with his characters. Now, we did have one thing. There's no Amber there because Roger said he didn't want anyone else to write Amber. So we honored that. I mean, in my case, the whole reason that anthology exists is because I read that story, The Night Kings, and the whole setup on that was that he wanted to pack as many current cliches into a story as he could and have it actually be a story that wasn't cliched, which I think he pulled off. But one of the big cliches at the time was everything was a trilogy. Everything had a sequel. So he put all the little hooks in to start the next story. You know, he had each of the side of light and the side of dark each had an assistant that they were training, and then there was a little bit of interplay between the two of them, so it was clear something was going to happen with the two of them in the next book. But Roger never intended to write it. That was part of the joke. But as the young college student that I was when I read it, that stuck with me, and I just kept envisioning the story, and it kept blowing up in my head, but I couldn't write it because I didn't have the rights. I didn't know Roger, and then it just never went away. So this, I'm somebody that a story plagues until he writes it. When I get a story idea, if I want it out of my brain, I have to write it. So 20 years later, I approached the Zelazny estate with the idea of doing this anthology and letting all kinds of people do this just so I could write that damn story and get it the hell out of my head. And that's the story you see.
Yeah. And so we talked last time I spoke to you, we talked about this, but at that time I hadn't read the story. But now I have, so I can confirm that you did an uncanny job of writing.
That is one of the things all the reviews said. Virtually every review of that anthology singled that story out. And also I didn't get a single negative any feedback, which I was expecting because I was the editor, so I thought people would crucify me. But I didn't care. I needed to write that story. But strangely, even people who hated the anthology liked that story. And that always bugged me. I'm like, they hated every story in it but mine. I'm like, well, what does that say about mine? How did I screw that up? Because there's a lot of good stuff in there.
Yeah, I've only read The Night Heirs so far, but I really liked The Night Heirs. And it does sound... Yeah, like I said, uncannily like a Roger Zelazny story.
And it's funny because I've tried to. I do occasionally have to write in other people's style for different projects, and I don't like doing it. But with Roger, it was effortlessly because he was my favorite writer by far. I've read every one of his books at least 5 times, some 10 and 20 times, and so it was just let it go, be Zelazny, and it just worked.
Mm. And so the story overall is written in his style, but then there's like lines here or there which are sort of little like winks to different
callbacks.
Books. Yeah. So like at one point the narrator says, "I did that thing."
That was the one I was going to mention. Yep, I made sure that was in there.
If people don't know, that's sort of a characteristic Zelazny flourish. A lot of times his narrators will say, and then I did that. They'll be contemplating some course of action or something, and then they'll say, "And then I did that thing."
Yeah.
So I liked that. There's a line, "Unchivalrous, I know, but this wasn't the Olympics."
Yeah, and then that is, of course, a callback to when Corwin kills one of the barons from Chaos, and which, of course, ruins his relationship with Dara. But again, it's not the Olympics. You don't do that. You want to live. You're not scoring points. And that was where that came from. You did catch that.
Yeah. So this is in the Courts of Chaos, the 5th Amber book is from there. Yeah. And then there's this line, the character says, "I knew that if she smiled, her teeth would be very white and quite perfect." And I feel like that might also be a wink to something. It had sort of a familiar resonance to me, but I wasn't sure.
One of the things that Roger often made people green-eyed. The women in his stories were green-eyed. So she had green eye, and he did often mention the perfect teeth. So, and I think he did mention that in the story. So I also in his story. So I alluded back to that there. But that I did try to make her the quintessential Zelazny female protagonist or major character.
So what is that? What is the quintessential Zelazny female?
Blonde, green eyes, very capable. In this case, I mean, I don't want to spoil the story for people, but she's more capable than he is, and he just doesn't know it. The main character.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a terrific story, and I definitely recommend it. And yeah, I'm looking forward to maybe reading the rest of the book at some point. Because yeah, I really obviously, you know, Zelazny's my favorite author, and I'm always intrigued by people who you know, are influenced by him, like you know, Stephen Bruce or you know, people like that.
And Stephen's in there, and yeah, I mean, I know so many people because we all had the same favorite author that I've met over the years.
Yeah. So so there's like a nice Zelazny.
It's a fraternity.
Yeah.
Neil Gaiman said that we were all his bastard sons.
Yeah, I've heard that story. That there were the way I heard it, at least, is that at Zelazny's funeral, there were a couple writers hanging around, like Walter John Williams and Neil Gaiman and I think Stephen
and George Martin.
Yeah. And so his influence lives on for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the only, and I hate to make this comparison, but the only comparison I can think of somebody who has had the kind of effect that he has had would be the rock band Kiss. You can hate Kiss if you want, but look at every single hair band that came out in the 80s loved Kiss. All the grunge bands loved Kiss. The reason that Kiss got into the Hall of Fame wasn't because of their music. It was because of all the musicians who said they wouldn't let their band go into the Hall of Fame if Kiss wasn't there first. Now, I'm not saying that Roger was Kiss in any way. I think that they are a much better band than most people give them credit for, but Roger gets all the credit he deserves. But he did the same thing. He made you want to do what he was doing.
I read a critical analysis one time where they said that, you know, toward the end of his career, the critics, you know, were less enamored with Roger than they had been at the beginning. And this person said, well, kind of what happened is that everybody started imitating Roger. So, you know, his work didn't stand out as much only because everybody else was kind of copying him. Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of that. But the other thing that I think is that he was exploring things, trying to find out where the edges were that he wanted to push, and he got to them. And everyone's like, well, you know, it's like a writer. I heard somebody say who put the magic tricks away one at a time. And I'm like, well, how many times do you want to watch the same magician pull the same rabbit out of the same hat? At some point, when does that stop being impressive? And I never understood the people who were on him for not doing the same tricks over and over again.
Yeah. I mean, and I like the work throughout his career myself. Yeah. So,
I mean, his last book was one of my favorites. A Night in the Lonesome October is brilliant and fun.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and one of the things I wanted to bring up is that he had this amazing sense of humor. So I want to read this quote from the book. He says, "If I were in the process of counseling a would-be SF writer, I would say to him, you need a sense of humor and a sense of place. You need a sense of history and a sense of time. You need a sense of science and a sense of the human condition. You need a sense of the fear, shame, and mocking laughter, which, for want of a better word, I'll call the guilt involved in being a man. But most of all, you need a sense of humor."
Yeah.
And I think that says a lot because I think he had, you know, out of all the sort of top flight science fiction writers of his day, you know, Delaney, Le Guin, Dish, he was like by far the funniest. And I think that's
by far. I mean, it wasn't even close. Who else writes what may be the best science fiction novel of all time so that in the middle of it, he can say, and then the fit hit the shan? You know, who else would have the courage to do that in such a groundbreaking and amazing book? He knew what he was doing. He knew he was writing a book that was going to change the slope of science fiction. And yet he still did that. I think too many other people who were as ambitious with that first novel as he was would never have had the courage to do that.
Yeah, and we're talking about Lord of Light in case anyone listening doesn't know. Well, that's interesting too, because he says in this book, he says one of his kind of guidelines or pieces of advice to writers is to take risks.
Yep.
And he says that the book you just mentioned, A Night in the Lonesome October, the premise is that it's told from the point of view of Jack the Ripper's dog, and he views Jack as a sympathetic figure, in the most positive.
Yeah, when I interviewed him one time, he said to me, that he tried to do that because anybody who treats their dog well is going to come across as a decent person if the dog tells the story.
Yeah, yeah. But so he says in this book that he, would have been too afraid earlier in his career to write that book. And so he took a risk and it really paid off with Night in the Lonesome October. And he says at one point he lists his 5 favorite novels from the ones that he wrote and says they're all the ones. These are my favorites, probably because these are the ones where I took a risk and it paid off in all of these.
And they're also some of the ones that I love. Eye of Cat is marvelous. And that is one of the ones he mentioned. Of course, Lord of Light is amazing.
Yeah, Doorways in the Sand was on there.
Oh, which is such a fun, wonderful book.
Yeah.
Probably his most poetic book.
My friend Tom Garenser, we did an episode where we reviewed the best of Roger Zelazny, the recent SF Masterworks edition. Yeah. But Tom, he's a huge fan of Doorways in the Sand. He just talks about it all the time.
It's a beautiful book. It's so much fun to read. I always read it to people. I mean, I've read it out loud to several people to make this so I could give them the rhythm, because not everybody can catch the rhythm in the writing. But my first love is science fiction. My second love was the English Romantic poets. So I had something in common with Zelazny. While he was more Jacobean than English Romantic, it was poetry was his first love. And if you can read with the poetry and you can read and feel the rhythm of prose, he gets even better.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I said this last time we talked, but if you can get his books on audio read by him, like nothing beats that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great listening to the first 9 Amber books. I have those that he read, and the Night in the Lonesome October is just brilliant, his reading of it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me get to some of my favorite Roger Zelazny writing advice here. So one of the ones that made a huge impression on me, and I must have read this as a kid because I definitely remember this, is he basically says when you first describe a character, try to limit it to three details. And he says if a fourth one sneaks in easily, okay, but that if you give too many details, the character, it's just more than the mind can take in at one gulp, and
eyes glaze over. They don't zero in and get to know the character better. They actually end up further away. They bounce right off the description.
Yeah, so I always tried to follow that rule myself. I actually, when I used to teach writing, and I used to do a little exercise where I would tell people this Roger Zelazny advice. And then as a point of comparison, I would read a description of a character from Dracula, from the Bram Stoker novel Dracula.
God. Oh, so much stalwart manhood in that book.
And it's this huge long paragraph of description about the noble nostrils and mobile mouth, lips, and all this kind of stuff. And you get to the end of it, and I would ask the students, okay, can anyone here tell me what color this character's hair is?
Yeah.
Absolutely nobody could do it because there was so many details.
One of the things I'll say is you can tell it was written by a man who went to all male boarding schools. You can just tell that.
Yeah.
That isn't always bad. You can also tell that with everything Tolkien ever wrote, but it's a whole lot easier to read than Dracula, though I've read Dracula probably 10 times.
Yeah, it's a cool book, but definitely there's too much description like that.
Oh, yeah. And of course, there's stuff that just cracks you up, like everybody freaking out about how hot paprika is. Like, yep, you're British.
Okay, I don't remember that detail, but that's
yeah. Funny. It was something that Jonathan wrote back to Mina that the food here was very spicy because they put paprika in everything.
Okay. So don't describe the characters. It's interesting though too, because Zelazny says in here that I have trouble writing about anything unless I am able to visualize it with absolute, fidelity. So it's not a matter of having only a sketchy idea of what the character looks like. His point is to know everything about what the character looks like, but only give you the key features. Yeah.
Which isn't that different than one of the things he suggests, which is to write a scene that doesn't make it into the story or the book so that you know something about the character that the readers don't, so that they feel more real. I mean, while I don't do that, I know that in a lot of cases I have, with like my first really professional story that I ever wrote, I know I made the character have a girlfriend just because it always bugged me that nobody's ever in a relationship in the books. Now, it made the whole story harder to write because I had to write around that. But 90% or more of all people are in a relationship for almost their entire adult life. And yet in science fiction, these people show up and they're always single and unattached. So I would always try to know stuff about the characters I didn't tell as a result of being a fan of Zelazny's, so that it would hopefully transcend the text, so that you would know that the writer knows more and there is more to know, and that the character doesn't just pop into existence to service the plot and then pop back out.
Yeah, and he gives an example from one of his own books in here, I think it's from This Immortal, where the character, he just mentions that he went to his friend's daughter's birthday party or something.
Yep.
It has nothing to do with the story at all. It's just to make the world feel real.
And there's a story that he did eventually publish called Dismal Light, which is a story about the son of the protagonist in Isle of the Dead, and how he came to his son's rescue when his son was staying on a planet that he was going to die on if he stayed there, so that we'd know more about he'd know more about the character. Ultimately, he sold it to somebody because they were bugging him for a story, and that was all he had on hand. But he'd written an entire, basically, chapter that was never going to be in the book.
I remember, this is online somewhere, that there's a scene from Trumps of Doom, the 6th Amber book, of Merlin walking the Logris, that, was never intended to be published. It's just part of his.
Well, it was. I mean, he ultimately had it published in the slipped case, sign numbered edition. So I had that as soon as it came out, and we did put it back into the ebooks.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't included in the commercial release, but it was in the Underwood Miller sign limited.
So I always thought it was an example of him just writing something that the reader would not have to provide greater depth to the world.
I mean, he didn't discuss it, so I don't know if that is the case. It certainly would have fallen in line with that, or if he wrote it so that people would want to buy that $200 limited edition that now goes for more than $1,000.
Do you know, are there other examples of the things that he didn't originally intend to include?
Those are the only two that are coming to my mind real quickly that he didn't include. I mean, there was a couple of sex scenes. There's a sex scene that he wrote for, I don't remember which of the. I think it might have been
Guns of Avalon. I know.
Yeah, Guns of Avalon. That he was expecting to get pulled out, and that one has been published. It was published in Nesfa's complete short works, which aren't quite as complete as most people would think, but it's a pretty damn good collection all the same.
Oh, maybe we can. How are they not as complete as? Because I've read them all. So
there's a number of nonfiction pieces that didn't make it in, and which I may include in the when I produce a trade paper of this book in about 6 months. And I've got 2 short stories that haven't been published that I was able to get my hands on that I'm hoping to put into I have a super pack line that I've got, I think, 55 copies of an author and just a lot of their work, and usually 500 pages worth of their work in one collection. So I'm going to be putting them in that later this year.
So these are 2 never before published Roger Zelazny stories.
Well, one of them is kind of, I wouldn't say never before published. It was actually a letter that he wrote to Carl Yoke about waking up and being back in the army and going through what he had done in his day, and saying he's trying to figure out how to get home, but he still hasn't, and he's still stuck there in the past. And I'm like, that's a story. But the other is a short story that was just never sent out.
Okay, yeah, well, I'll look forward to those.
Trent found it and sent it to me, and he has no idea why it was in the records, but he doesn't know why it didn't get sent out.
Huh. I'll just explain, I guess, about the sex scenes if people don't know. Is that so? Roger had this idea that he would include sort of over the top gratuitous sex scene in each Amber novel, starting with the second one, that he was just counting on his editor to, want him to cut out, and then he would take them all and package them up as an article and sell it to a men's magazine, as like deleted sex scenes that my editor made me take out that he thought would just be funny, but he kind of got bored with the idea.
Yeah. Well, the other thing was that to some extent he was doing it because every editor wants to put their little stamp on the book. So they'd always say, take that out or add a thing to it. And so he gave them something obvious so they'd feel like they'd done something. And that would leave his book alone.
Well, that reminds me of a detail. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I said I'd heard him say that at a convention. So it was, while he always said that he did it so he could write that article, there was a bit more to it than that.
Huh. I mean, there's a funny detail in here where for one of his early books, I think the copy editor wants to delete a scene. And so Roger goes to New York and talks to his editor. And he says, I really want to keep this scene. Is there any way we could possibly do it? And the editor says, oh, yeah, no problem. And Roger's like, I don't want to upset the copy editor. Aren't they important people? And the editor says, no, they're just kids we just hired right out of college. Like, just ignore them,
Yeah. I remember him saying that. I know that he sold a story. He had a story that he sent somewhere. I think it wasn't fantastic. I don't remember who it was, but they had wanted to buy it from them, but he wanted him to cut it from 3,000 words to 1,500. He said he struck every other word, didn't like the way it sounded, and sold it to somebody else.
Well, that'll show him.
Yeah, I mean, the way he came up and how fast he became, top dog in the field is kind of shocking. I don't know that anybody else has ever done it like that.
Yeah, not that I know of for sure. Okay, so the next thing I've got here is find inspiration in the yellow pages. This is another piece of advice I associate with Zelazny specifically.
I mean, I used to get my names out of the for characters if I was just looking for a general name and not trying to do something clever with the name. I would take a first name and then I would page through and I would find an interesting last name that I would never have thought of myself to make it feel more like real people. But in his case, he was talking about that particular thing is talking about the doors of his face, the lamps of his mouth, and there was the bait. There was a bait.
Yeah, bait and tackle.
A bait and tackle ad and something else. And then he put them all together into one story. And that was also something else he recommended is read lots of different things at the same time, because then you get these different elements that sneak into a story and make it bigger and give it more depth. I mean, that's the thing I've tried to do all my life is read a lot like he did, although I fail miserably. I realized once I read how much he read, how many books he read, and saw all the titles when I did Immer's Laz. But at any rate, it really, really helps. You do find that these disparate things that you're studying and reading find their way into one story and really make for something interesting that you couldn't have done if you weren't reading these different subject matters.
Yeah, somewhere in the collected stories, it claims that he would read 5 to 7 books a week.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, based on I had to add, and I did it, in the back of Immer's Laz. If you look, I mean, there's a really long, just lost
like
the word.
A reading list.
Well, it would be a reading list, but it was the indexed in the back of every person, every professional person he mentioned and every book that he mentioned. And it was all the books, and he would just mention what he'd finished reading that week and what he just started to Carl. And so if you look in the back, it's one hell of a reading list. And, I didn't put it down one line. That's the one thing in the book that I put 2 columns in so I could fit it. It was still like 50 pages. 10 point. I don't remember if I made it smaller than 10 point or 9 point, but it's small type. And it goes on and on and on. He read an unbelievable amount of books.
Yeah. And on all different, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, like any, art criticism, history, just anything you could, science, anything you could imagine.
Yep. Hard science, soft science, kind of kooky science, just all of it.
I guess I'll say if this wasn't clear, his technique for the Yellow Pages was to look at the ads for businesses and
Yep.
imagine what that business would be like in 50 years. So yeah,
Right. And that's
so
where
an
the
ad.
bait and tackle came into the story, which happens on Venus back before we knew it was a huge ball of nothing, and we thought it might have swamps and oceans, and he placed it there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
In
so
that scene.
I've always loved that, because people, writers always hate being asked, where do you get your ideas? And I've always thought, well, that answer, from the Yellow Page,
Yep.
open the Yellow Pages and imagine these businesses in 50 years. That's a really great concrete
Yeah. I mean,
example.
in my collection of short stories, I decided to tell everybody exactly where the stories came from. But I realized that also ruined the stories, so I put it at the end of the stories rather in front of them.
Yeah, I think that's the way to do it. That's what I did in my short story collection as well.
Yeah.
And this one I thought was interesting. Write atmosphere and action scenes in slow motion. So, because he says sort of, like everything else you kind of write at, or I don't know about everything else, but most other things you write at sort of normal pace.
Right.
But if you're trying to establish atmosphere, or if you're telling an action scene, you gotta
get it right.
Show all the details, not just sort of skim over anything.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. One of the things when you read I've read so many books where I can't figure out what's really happening in a fight scene. I fenced in college, as did Roger, so I think it's fantastic listening to he said bat par. He mentions the paris and the different ways that they fight and the positions, and I know all of them. And it's wonderful, and also his hand to hand. He was a black belt in Aikido, so it was very interesting seeing that his fight scenes are always very well choreographed and always perfect.
Yeah, the scene in A Rose for Ecclesiastes, where the Gallanter fights the sort of Martian guard, I just think is incredible if you're into martial arts kind of stuff.
Right, which he was. I mean, his son Trent had 3 black belts, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, so his love of martial arts was transferred to one of his kids. I mean, for all I know, it could be with the other 2, but I neither of them I've actually never spoken with Devin, and Shannon's never mentioned it.
Well, I guess that was one thing that really struck me reading Immer's Laz, as well as just how many activities, not just that all the activities Roger was doing, opera and skiing and, going out to eat and everything. But the kids, too, seem to have just incredibly active social lives and activities and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, Trent and I used to talk martial arts a lot because we'd studied some of the same ones. He was much better at all that stuff than I was, but we could talk about Muay Thai and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. All right, we've got something that Roger actually talks about a lot. Is he says that sort of the big problem that writers of fantasy and science fiction have is that you have the rules of this world, and you have to do all the things that any other sort of fiction does in terms of character and everything, but you also have to explain how this world works. But you can't just load it all at the beginning. You have to kind of...
You can't do info dumps and be just too much exposition. You've got to make the people want it. Now, he would do all kinds of neat tricks, like what he did in, what was the name of that book? Shoot. Oh, An Eye of Cat, where he needed to give the information. So he would do something, instead of just give the information, he would do like little cards on each of the characters. And so he found ways to get around that because he was such a good writer.
Yeah, he talks about being inspired by John Dos Passos, the USA trilogy of having kind of news clippings and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, he did a lot of that in Eye of Cat. And also there was the story, This Moment of the Storm, which I actually have the painting that Bob Eggleton did for our anthology. Actually, not that anthology, but for the Magic. But at any rate... in that one, he does a thing where he just has somebody describing the planet from above because it's in the future and it's on another planet. And he does it in a very poetic way. But again, it's an info dump, but he made it masterful and put it right at the beginning of the story, and it worked.
Yeah. Yeah, that's and actually speaking of this moment of the storm, one thing I wanted to ask you was, so I think I mentioned my friend Tom and I recently we reviewed the Best of Roger Zelazny, this
Yeah.
new collection from part of the SF Masterworks series,
Right.
and there are like at least 12 stories I can think of off the top of my head that aren't included in that book that are just as good as, that belong in a Best of Roger Zelazny.
I mean, I don't know how you choose a best of and don't make it 1,000 pages.
But so I was wondering if you have any idea if they'll ever do a Best of Roger Zelazny Volume 2 or...
Oh, I have no idea. I don't know those folks. We haven't spoken. They didn't reach out to me. I didn't even know they were doing it. So, yeah, no idea. I think they included my very favorite story, which is Divine Madness.
Yeah, that's definitely in there.
That is a brilliant story. Not one wasted word.
Because I want to do a follow-up, with Tom reviewing, my 12 other favorite Roger Zelazny stories that aren't in that book. But, they're all scattered over all these different books. So it'd be handy if there was some follow-up volume that had,
Yeah, I mean, with the magic, we tried to do those 10 novellas that just put him on Mount Rushmore of science fiction.
Yeah. So, but I want to, there's like, I mean, there's 6 stories from, I have a whole list here of like, and some of them are like, he wrote one called Itself Surprised for Fred Saberhagen Berserker anthology that I really love. So yeah, just putting that out there. If a best of volume 2 kind of thing would definitely be something I would be interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at this point, I have every story he's ever written somewhere. So I haven't actually even seen the collection.
Mm-hmm. I guess if it wasn't clear, This Moment of the Storm is one of the ones that was left out.
Yeah. So. Yeah. I mean, it would have to be. It's so brilliant.
All right. So let's see. What do we got? Write stories that include multiple readings. So this is something I thought was really cool, is he talks about in so many of his books that you can read it either as a fantasy or a science fiction or various, He
did that on purpose. Like that. Yeah. Lord of Light, depending on how you see it, could be science fiction or it could be fantasy. And that if you read it as science fiction, it is a slightly different story than if you read it as fantasy. And he did that on purpose. He didn't like being bound by either rules.
Yeah, actually, I have the quote here. So he says, I followed this pattern in my first book, This Immortal, by leaving certain things unexplained and open to multiple interpretations. I did it again in my second book, The Dream Master, only there the dark areas were in the human psyche rather than in events. It was present in the, I don't know how to pronounce this, Payan religion and its effects on my narrator, Francis Sandow, in the otherwise science fiction novel Isle of the Dead. Yep. In Lord of Light, I wrote a book where events could be taken either as science fiction or as fantasy, with but a slight shifting of accent, and so on, up through my recent novel Eye of Cat, where the final quarter of the book may be taken either as fantasy or as hallucination, according to one's taste in such matters.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's part of where some of the power comes from his books, is that he isn't just doing what everybody else does, and there's just more to it, and you have to engage more with his work. And the thing is, that sounds like a chore, but it's not. You almost can't help yourself. It is just so rich.
Yeah, I mean, when Tom and I talked about A Rose for Ecclesiastes, we talked about it for a long time, and one of the things that we kept coming back to is at the end. I guess, I don't know if I want to give spoilers or not, but
well, I mean, the story was written in the 60s.
Yeah, is basically like, is the story making, a rationalist argument, or is the fact that the narrator was being manipulated by the Martians to fulfill their prophecy the whole time, does that make it not a rationalist and more, supernatural or something? And so the fact that the story is kind of open to interpretation on that point makes it something you can keep coming back to and keep talking about over and over again.
That's probably also one of my favorite stories by Roger. And the other would probably be, I really, really loved, The Graveyard Heart. I have a thunderstorm coming through, so if I'm suddenly gone, that would be why.
Well, that's appropriate since we've been talking about this moment of the storm.
Yes.
Storm to come in. Graveyard Heart is another one that was not included in the best of Roger Zelazny that I want to talk about in the future. So,
well, one thing that's really kind of neat about that story is, and I spoke with some people about it who he had talked to. I've talked with Roger, but never about that was essentially a metaphor for science fiction writers. Everybody wants to write science fiction, and the people who make it, who can sell their work and make a living at it, they're in the set. And the conventions are the parties.
It was actually fun. There's a line that really struck me in one of the early essays where he talks about the reasons to write science fiction, and one of them is for the money. You know, he says that anyone who's basically any story that's any good will sell somewhere, and you can get paid for it, and then a decade or two goes by, and it's like, okay, well, it's gotten a lot more competitive now. It's maybe not so much the way it was, but certainly, if you're writing science fiction for the money these days, you're not making good.
If you're writing for the money these days, it's a problem. It's not just science fiction. I mean, essentially, Amazon has destroyed the mid-list. And, as far as I can tell, they're not allowing any new writers to hit big because of their algorithm in the way that George R.R. Martin did, or J.K. Rowling did, or Neil Gaiman, or John Grisham. I mean, name the last big writer that blew everybody away and made millions. It's not happening anymore.
Yeah, so it definitely struck me reading that. I was like, okay, wow, things have really changed since this was written.
No, I could name probably 50 authors, which I won't do, but I could name probably 50 authors who used to sell 30 to 50,000 copies of every book they wrote and did so for 10 or 20 years. Now I don't know anybody who does that. And I know pretty much most of the writers in the field.
Yeah, I mean, Roger also mentions the short fiction magazines having circulations of around 60,000 copies per issue, which is...
Yeah, now they're all in the 10 to 15,000 range. When I bought Realms of Fantasy, it was down to almost 20,000, and it was the biggest in the field. Yeah.
So reading these essays is kind of, in a way, like traveling back to a more congenial time for science fiction writers.
Yep. When I read some of the pulp magazines and get my hands on them and look over and see if there's anything I want to revive, I'm often stunned by how bad the writing was. And I wish that I could have been writing then, because it would have been easy to, rise up above what was being published at the time.
Yeah, well, I heard this story that has always stuck with me, that John W. Campbell, after a while, he couldn't get, like Robert Heinlein to write stories for him anymore, because Heinlein was having so much more success writing novels.
Yep.
And so Campbell's strategy was he would start a conversation, they would be at a convention or a party or something, and he would start a conversation with Heinlein, and he would say, wouldn't it be great to have a swimming pool, like to put a swimming pool in your backyard? Wouldn't that be great? And he would get Heinlein going on how great that would be. And then he would say, oh, but if you sold me a story, then you could use the money to buy a swimming pool. And just the idea that, you could make enough money from a short story sale to buy a swimming pool.
Which, the pay rate didn't ever go up much. And that was really because the magazines were shrinking. The advertising wasn't there, and they just didn't have the money to pay more. I've always heard people complaining about how cheap all the magazines were. I'm like, yeah, but they're trying not to go out of business.
Yeah, something Zelazny mentions over and over again, which had not ever made a big impression on me, was a bust in the pulp magazines that apparently happened in the 50s, and he actually says it was good for the field because it sort of incentivized authors to move into the paperback.
And it got rid of the writers who weren't all that good, because there were so many magazines and they had to fill space. They were buying subpar work knowingly. They didn't have a choice. They had to fill the pages. And those guys all fell away when that happened.
Yeah, well, he's also saying that the pulp magazines had fairly strict limitations on.
Mostly they did, yeah. Mostly they did, which is odd because once, go to the 60s and 70s. And when I was editing, I felt like I could take a risk because if one story fell flat, it was okay. I had 7 or 9 more that didn't fall flat. And so I've always thought magazines were the best place to take risks. But in the 30s, 40s, 50s, they didn't take risks.
Yeah, so in terms of sex and,
Right.
religion and topics like that were kind of taboo.
Or even
apparently.
wild writing that didn't, a story that wasn't necessarily easy to parse. You couldn't do that. You couldn't say, I still think the payoff here is great, even though most people will be left scratching their heads. You couldn't do that back then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it was just really striking for me because Zelazny, he mentions it just over this bust over and over and over again in these different essays. And I was like, wow, This is something that, even as someone who's fairly serious about the history of science fiction, it was just not like hugely on my radar.
Well, people didn't really, other than Roger, I never heard anyone actually talking about it much. I didn't live through that. I was born in '64, so I even missed Roger's first publication. So, we've got this history. Living through history is very different than reading about it.
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing I really like about this book is it kind of gives you a chance to live vicariously through history because if we didn't say the first essay is from like 1964 and the last one's from like 1994. So it's the whole
covers his entire career.
Yeah. So that was really interesting. And you mentioned in the intro that he, you see him go from kind of a new writer who's a little bit, uncertain of his place in the publishing world and everything to an established pro who's just completely confident of his ability.
Yes. Yeah, he was very sure of his place in science fiction as well. He should have been.
Yeah. So again, I'm really glad that this book exists. I can never get enough Roger Zelazny. He's just such a smart, funny, interesting, thoughtful writer. So thanks again, Warren, for putting this book together.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad it's out there.
I appreciate you giving me a platform so that more people will hear about it.
Yeah. I definitely hope everyone listening will go check it out, especially all the Zelazny fans out there.
Yeah.
I guess, do you have any other final thoughts or anything, Warren, before we?
I will mention it's available in hardcover and as an ebook, and will be coming out, and I think an expanded edition in trade paper in about 6 months.
And you said there will be some bonus material in the trade paper.
I believe so. Yep. Someone's pointed me to some stuff I missed, and I'm like, oh, damn. So the great thing about being a publisher is I get to fix any of those kinds of things that I run into. The thing I always tell people is, the thing about, anytime you read an anthology or a collection, there's always something in it that just doesn't quite move you. Unless you edited it, then everything is awesome. I have books that I think are perfect, and you don't get that experience if you're not an editor. So that part's fun.
Yeah, cool. Are there any other Zelazny projects in the works?
Well, we are putting out we're going to probably put out all of his novellas in standalone so we can get some neat art and put them out there so that people who aren't aware of him will maybe stumble into him at Amazon or wherever and find these really good stories, books that are about 40 to 100 pages. We've got, I don't know, maybe 8 to 10 of them now. I'd have to look at I have over 7,000 books in print, so it's hard to remember. I have over 10,000 print, I have over 7,000 print books and 3,000 or 4,000 ebooks. So it's hard for me to remember what's what and what I've done. I have to look at my production schedule.
Yeah, but I like now if I search on Amazon for Roger Zelazny, all these books that you've done pop up, like the with improved cover art, like
yes.
For a Breath I Tarry and the Unicorn Variations, and it's
yeah,
nice
and that's the thing that that Roger's kids were really happy with is we're putting everything into making brilliant covers, because I think part of what happened to poor Roger is he was such a bankable commodity. They're just like, just give him that thing over there, that cover that won't sell anybody else. Roger doesn't need it. So he had a lot of bad covers in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I vividly remember, the first Amber book that I picked up was The Guns of Avalon, and I picked it up because I thought it must be humorous fantasy because the cover was so kind of goofy looking.
Yeah.
And then the second one I ever came across was Night of Shadows, and it was just like in a supermarket like rack or something,
Right.
and I grabbed it and I told my dad I wanted to buy it, and he's like, what is it looks like a guy with holding a plastic sword with like plastic monsters kind of floating in the air.
Right. Yeah, that was
him.
terrible. I know the cover you're talking about. It was just there was like some digital stuff in there. It was just not to my taste. That's what I'll say.
Yeah. So no, it's definitely great if he's got some better covers.
We were happy. I mean, I was really happy to be able to do all 10 of the Amber novels with the covers that I thought they deserved.
Yeah, because it was always, I always had to read the books in spite of the covers, and it was always a little bit of a challenge proselytizing for them with the covers that they had. Yeah, so. All right, cool. So I think I think we'll wrap things up there.
Alrighty.
So we've been speaking with Warren Lapine about this new book on writing science fiction and fantasy by Roger Zelazny. So Warren, thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you for having me.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Warren Lapine for joining us on the show. This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy was made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.